There is a woman in the Bible that most churches never talk about. She is mentioned only once, and when she is mentioned, two of the most powerful people in the Old Testament are immediately struck with a crisis that nearly tears apart the entire Exodus. Her name is never given. Subscribe to Axumcode. We cover the history they removed from the textbooks. Turn on notifications so you never miss a revelation. But the Bible tells us exactly who she was and where she came from. Numbers chapter 12, verse 1. And Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. One verse, hidden in plain sight, and in that one verse, the entire story of Africa's place inside the biblical record cracks wide open. Who was this woman? Why did her existence threaten everything, and why has her story been buried for centuries? To understand who Moses married, you first have to understand the world he lived in. Moses was born in Egypt around 1300 BCE, but Egypt in 1300 BCE was not an isolated civilization that modern maps suggest. It was surrounded and, in many periods, dominated by African kingdoms to the south. Directly above Egypt along the Nile sat the kingdom of Kush, also called Nubia, also called in the Hebrew Bible, Kush. This was not a minor territory. At its height, the Kushite Empire stretched from what is now central Sudan all the way north into Egypt. In 744 BCE, Cushite pharaohs, black African kings, actually conquered Egypt and ruled it for nearly a century. Historians call this the 25th dynasty, and for 100 years the most powerful empire on earth was ruled from Africa. But Moses lived before all of that, and in his time, Cush was already ancient, already powerful, already deeply connected to the Hebrew story. The name Cush appears in Genesis chapter 10 in the Table of Nations. Cush was the grandson of Noah, the son of Ham, and from Cush came some of the most significant civilizations in the ancient world. Now here's what most people miss. Moses did not spend his entire life in Egypt. After killing an Egyptian soldier and fleeing Pharaoh's wrath, Moses escaped into the wilderness. He went to a land called Midian, a territory in the northwestern Arabian Peninsula, bordering the Red Sea, directly adjacent to African territory. In Midian, Moses met a man named Jethro, a priest, and Moses married Jethro's daughter. Her name was Zipporah. Zipporah, the first woman Moses married. But Numbers 12 speaks of a second wife, an Ethiopian woman, a Cushite woman, an African woman. And this is where history gets complicated and where the story gets extraordinary. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Moses had one wife or two. Some say Zipporah herself was Cushite, that Midian and Cush overlapped geographically, and that the Ethiopian woman of Numbers 12 is simply another name for the same woman. Others argue that Moses, after Zipporah, took a second wife, a woman explicitly identified in Hebrew as a Kushit, a Cushite, an African woman. But here is what both sides agree on. The word used in Numbers 12:1 in the original Hebrew is Kushit. That word does not mean Arab. It does not mean Semitic. In every place the word Cush appears in the Hebrew Bible, all 58 occurrences, it refers to the region south of Egypt, the land of dark-skinned people, the land of Africa. Moses' wife was African. That is not an interpretation. That is what the text says. Now watch what happens next. When Miriam and Aaron attack Moses over this woman, God himself responds. Not with silence, not with a gentle correction. God calls all three of them, Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, to the door of the tabernacle, and then God descends in a pillar of cloud.
Numbers chapter 12, verses 6 to 9. God speaks directly. He defends Moses. He calls Moses the most faithful servant he has. And then he leaves. And when the cloud lifts, Miriam is struck with leprosy. White as snow, the text says. White as snow. Think about what just happened. Miriam, who objected to Moses' African wife, is immediately punished. The punishment itself is described in terms of skin. She becomes white, like death, like something corrupted. This is not coincidence in a text where nothing is coincidence. Aaron immediately repents. Moses himself, the man whose wife was attacked, cries out to God to heal his sister. He does not demand justice, he begs for mercy for the woman who just tried to tear apart his marriage. That is the character of Moses, and that is the power of this story. But here's the layer that mainstream biblical education almost never teaches. The name Ethiopia in the Old Testament is not the modern Ethiopia of today, though the connection is real and direct. In the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, called the Septuagint, completed around 250 BCE, the word Kush was translated as Ethiopia, Ethiopia, and the Septuagint was the Bible used by the early Christian church. So when the King James Bible says Ethiopian woman, it's being completely accurate to the Greek tradition that preceded it. And here's why that matters. The Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, the royal line that ruled until 1974, traced its lineage directly to the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba, who came from the south, from Africa, from the land the Bible calls Kush. This is not mythology in Ethiopia, it is national identity. The Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's sacred royal chronicle, compiled in the 14th century, records in extraordinary detail the story of this royal lineage, and that chronicle begins with Africa's connection to the biblical record. Moses' wife is a thread in a much larger tapestry. Africa was never outside the Bible's story. Africa was woven into the Bible's story from the beginning. We have been taught to read the Bible as a Middle Eastern document with occasional mentions of Africa, but the evidence does not support that reading. From the Table of Nations in Genesis, where Africa's descendants are named and located, to Moses and his Cushite wife, to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, to the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, who was carrying the scroll of Isaiah when Philip found him. Africa is not in the margins of this story. Africa is in the spine of it. Every verse has a location. Every location has a story. And the story that has been hidden longest is the one that was there the whole time. If this documentary opened your eyes, subscribe to Axumcode. Every week, we go deeper into the stories that connect Africa to the biblical record. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who needs to see it. The next revelation drops soon.